Hey guys, for this week's workshop, Mike and I are doing it together. So very exciting.
Woo.
Woo! An in-person, both coaches session. Obviously it's a bit earlier than normal, so hopefully you guys are having an awesome Sunday if you're watching now, or if you're watching later, I hope it was a good weekend.
Let's jump into it, hey? So today we're talking about movement fundamentals and basically how to become better movers and runners. So running is a specific skill. And it's not something we learn overnight, as we've all realized by now. It's something that takes practice. And the action of running is very specific, right? And it builds on this foundation of having good movement, basically having mastery of the essentials. So, for example, you spend a lot of time on one leg when you're running. So if you're not stable on one leg, if you don't have stability or control in a single leg position, then it's really going to show up in your running. So I know for me, when I'm assessing patients, we used to have a treadmill, but even now we got rid of the treadmill. But I can tell if they're not able to do something slowly and even just stand on a single leg, then it always shows up when they're running, when the demand is higher, and they're fatigued and all those sorts of things. So this is what we're really focusing on talking about today, is partly, why are we doing strength training, but also why do we have such a big focus on the fundamentals?
What is it, Mike, you always say in clinic? If you can't do it slowly, you don't have permission to do it quickly?
Yes. And also you need to learn to decelerate before you learn to accelerate. And a lot of people just compensate with speed and try and rush through it because they don't have control over the basics.
And you sometimes will see that when people are running. You might notice people compromising somewhere or using other body parts, other muscles more than they should. And quite often it's to make up for a lack of mobility, stability, strength somewhere, which if you get them to really back off and go back down to the basics, fix it there, quite often it'll fix it up the line as well.
Yeah. And it can be quite a what, like back to your point just then, like people who have a stiff ankle, who lack ankle mobility, it can show up in their low back or even in their neck by these other areas compensating and working harder. So it can actually result in them coming in with neck pain and you're like, it's from your ankle. So very often we have to look at the whole body as well when we're looking at these fundamentals.
It often reminds me of going to a physio, and I feel like some physios are really good at this and some are not so good. And then if you present with a symptom, a lot of practitioners look at just that exact area and, I don't know, knee pain, for example. Oh, your knees are sore because only look at the knee, let's fix the knee. Maybe you improve and then you come back 3 months later with the exact same problem because the knee pain has been caused by all these other things that you haven't fixed in the first place. So it's like you haven't fixed the foundations in the first place before addressing the actual issue.
Another analogy, I'm all about the analogies, but another one that we often use in clinic is that victims scream and criminals remain silent.
Yeah,
and knee pain is a classic one for that. Usually it's victim to a hip or an ankle issue very commonly that set people up for knee issues.
All right.
You go.
Okay. So we've touched on the first point, the fact that, and as we have sort of hammered home a lot with our focus on technique and running form and working on the drills and paying attention to different parts of our running in everything that we do, hopefully you know by now that running is a specific skill. It does take a lot of movement practice and there's a lot of things that go into it, including the building of the foundations and why we always include strength training in all the programs. So it is important that we do build this big base of more generalized movement skills on which to base the more specific skill. So I guess probably using maybe an easy to understand example here would be as you grow up, you don't all of a sudden know how to run. You first started by crawling, then you learned to walk, and then you sort of found your feet and you started to run. So you really learnt one movement, you practiced it, and you built up and up from there. So Running's the same. Obviously, just when you're an adult, you jump straight to it without necessarily going back and fixing some of those early on movement patterns. But it is important to get the generalized movements down pat first and have that foundation of mobility, stability, control, and strength, which we will talk about in more detail one by one in a second. But it's important to have the good foundation of all four.
Yeah. And it's important to realize that you need to have good control before you then go and add weight or add intensity to your sessions, which a lot of people don't fully appreciate. They think it's a strength deficiency, and sometimes it's not a strength deficiency. Sometimes it's because they haven't mastered the basics, like they don't have mobility or they don't have control over a movement, even doing something body weight, and they've just added too much load too quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess doing it from a strength example is probably the easier one to understand, right? In the sense that, say you're doing squats and maybe you're really struggling with just your body weight squats of getting the depth. Well, stick with those body weight squats until you can get the depth right and you've got that movement under control before, for example, adding a 20 kilo bar plus weights to your back. It doesn't make sense, right? You've got to get the foundations right before you add weight. So it's the same thing we're talking about here with the running.
Well, yeah, because even with running, you can see when runners are getting tired, they might begin to lean forward too much, which indicates that they've lost some stability and control through their pelvis. They might lose control of that pelvis and go into that forward tilted position, which means that they're not propelling through their legs as well as they could, and they're using their low back too much. Their foot strike will change. Yeah. So yeah, it's applicable to running as well as strength training.
Yeah, and then the last point here I think is really important: form before ego. So this applies to everything. Running, we see quite often.
Life.
Yeah, life in general. Quite often the people fall into the grey zone that we've spoken about before because of ego. You are running along the street and someone else is running along faster than you. So then therefore you have to run faster, right? So lets the ego get in the way. Strength training, we often see this happening as well. You watch someone else in the gym with a bar that's twice as heavy as yours. So you try to match what they're doing before you're ready to. So try to take your ego out, strip it away and focus on what you're doing, what makes sense for your training, where you're at, and really try to work on form before everything else.
One more analogy.
Oh my God.
More, as I tell my patients all the time, more is not better, better is better. So a lot of people ask me, how many reps do I need to be doing of this exercise and those sorts of things? I'm like, you can do 1,000,000, but better is better, more isn't better. So if you start compromising form, then remember a lot of particularly in a rehab setting, a lot of what we're trying to do is improve people's ability to coordinate movement patterns and those sorts of things. So we have a very big focus on these basics. And if people are compromising form, then there's no point doing the exercise. It actually defeats the point.
Yeah.
Okay, so some basic definitions. Mobility, which is different to flexibility, as we'll explain in a minute. But mobility refers to the range of motion in a joint. So it's the range of movement that's available to you. It's the quantity of movement that's available to you. Versus stability or motor control. I don't love the term stability because it suggests that it stays still when in reality everything is moving. But it gives you another idea of this stability, which is or the control of a movement through its range. So basically, mobility is the quantity of movement, and stability or motor control is the quality of movement. And I think this joint-by-joint approach picture is really, really useful to realize because, for example, if we take the low back here, it's colored yellow, and what it's craving is stability, core stability, right? And what a lot of people lack is core stability. So it tends towards being too mobile in the low back. We see the opposite in the hip joint. The hip joint wants mobility. It can go in 360 degrees, and it has a tendency towards compressing and becoming not mobile enough. And then the knee, you get all these wobbly knee things going on when really the knee wants stability, right? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily staying still, but it's controlled through its motion, and it's partly controlled by the mobility in the ankle and in the hip and those sorts of things. So yeah.
Yeah, interestingly enough, also the order, just looking at it,
Yeah.
sort of like yellow, pink, yellow, pink,
Mhm.
yellow, pink. I think that's interesting how one joint next to another, they all work together.
Yeah.
I guess it goes back to what you're saying that, symptoms can present somewhere totally different, right?
Yeah. And also just the way muscles work is they need a fixed point and then a movable point. So very often people create a fixed point at their hip and move through their low back and then wonder why their hip flexors are always tight and they're getting sore hips. But it's because what we actually want is the opposite, a fixed point at the low back, so then the muscles can create movement and propulsion at the hip joint. So yeah, partly anatomical that too, but yeah, really good way of illustrating that.
All right. So I've said this before, mobility and flexibility, not the same thing. Did you actually want to explain this in more detail, what you meant?
Sure. So if I was to lie on my back and get someone to lift my leg into the air, we're testing hamstring flexibility, right? However, I'm going to ask you to do a toe touch. We actually require a lot more than hamstring flexibility. We require people to be able to shift their pelvis backwards. We require people to be able to create low shear through flexion through the entirety of the spine. We require people to be able to create shoulder flexion so they can actually reach forward with their arms. And there has to be some degree of control. It's a lot more active emotion than someone just lifting my leg into the air. So flexibility literally just refers to the ability of a muscle to tolerate a stretch sensation. However, it doesn't necessarily predict whether or not you're going to have control of that muscle through its full range of motion. So in some ways, mobility still requires some level of motor control and some level of control through the motion as well. And this is really important because we all know mobility is important for our general health, but part of the reasons for runners is because you can't build tension from a place of tension. A muscle has to be able to relax and lengthen in order to then contract. If we think very basically like force equals mass times acceleration, your mass is your body weight. So that's not really going to change a lot. Acceleration is referring to the ability of those muscles to contract from a relaxed state. If you're already tight, it's got nowhere to go. It can't actually create any force for you. So if you watch any really good sports player that we really like, the reason we like watching them is because they're relaxed. So mobility, in terms of a practical sense for runners, is the ability to create power from a relaxed state because you have that range of motion to work into. And if you can't lengthen anything, you then can't contract anything.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. We always talk about when you're running, also trying to remain relaxed, obviously from efficiency point of view and not just burning energy. But I guess you can potentially do less contractions if with every contraction you're getting more out of it, in a sense.
I think another really important point here to highlight is that we don't do static stretching before exercise. And that's actually been shown to increase people's risk of injury. By static stretching, we're referring to when you're just holding a stretch for a long length of time. So you'll see in all our warm-ups, we're always doing something more dynamic. So for example, rather than just doing a hamstring stretch and holding it, in the warm-ups, we're doing things like leg swings and like skipping and straightening our legs. And that way we're getting a much more active mobility through the hamstring, but it's a lot more dynamic. It's not static.
Yeah, I think that's an important one because it's often I think it's almost the myth which is just hung on for sort of a couple of generations of stretching, standing still before exercise. And you just increase your risk of injury. It doesn't help you warm up in any way.
Yeah.
So that's why we always include even slow drills, which are just getting you moving, bounding, things like that to, really dynamically warm up instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, the whole argument for static stretching has really sort of been debunked a little bit. And generally, from a mobility point of view now, everyone gets more out of being more active in their mobility training. I treat a lot of dancers, and still they're taught from a very young age to just wrench the tissues into these massive amounts of stretch, which is fine when you're young. But the number of dancers who I treat, like the minute they turn 20 and they continue to do that type of intense stretching, actually set them up for injury. Because it's a reflex. If your muscle thinks it's about to tear, which is essentially what happens if you overstretch it, it contracts and it shortens. So it's actually counterproductive to a certain point, or it actually just tears, which is what happens to a lot of my dancers sort of in the mid-20s up. And there's this TikTok craze going around at the minute, a bit of a side note, where they're doing the splits off like a shopping trolley. I literally had a dancer tear her hamstring last week doing that. And there's another one where they're doing splits off 2 cars that are driving in opposite directions. I'm like, that is just a recipe for disaster.
Oh my God.
But yeah, specifically for runners, do be aware of overstretching immediately after a session, particularly your hamstrings after sprinting, because a lot of that hamstring tension we feel after an interval session is because it's already been overstretched already, because it's the tension buildup is the hamstring during the swing phase of the leg, basically decelerating you so you don't smash into the floor. So a lot of that tension buildup is because it's already been overstretched. So just something to keep in mind, you know, if you are going to do a bit of static stretching, ease into it, be really gentle with it. Less is often more than too much, and you don't want to do it immediately after a session.
I was going to say, that's another almost myth. It doesn't have to be crazy painful stretching, right? Like, I think people think that unless it's really, really causing you a lot of pain, it's not like stretching, not doing the job. Not really the case.
Yeah, in actual fact, in most people's cases, it's doing less to really push into the stretch where it's like a 10 out of 10 pain.
100%. All right, we'll jump on. Stability motor control. So the key points here is, again, as we've said before, running is a one-legged sport. So it's important to actually have stability in that movement. So as Mike was saying before, we have to ensure that we can do things slowly in that position. So for example, one-legged type things. So can you stand on one leg for one? That's probably more difficult than you might realize. Can you do single leg squats? Can you do single leg deadlifts? Easy ways to practice, if that's all too easy, just stand on your leg with your eyes closed, for example. Just test out how much stability you actually have in single leg movements. Because if you think about it, running is always on one leg. That's literally like the definition between walking and running, is that running is you only have one leg on the floor at all times. Yeah. So it's pretty important that we actually have control in that movement as we're performing everything on one foot.
Which is why they're often in the programs for the strength sessions, is that we do lots of one-legged work. And I know for me, they're my least favorite because they're the hardest.
Yeah.
But so important.
Yeah.
Cool. So once you have the basics of mobility and stability and you can control yourself with body weight, then we can begin to add load, right? But there's no point adding excessive load until we've mastered the basics, until we have control of those. And so then we can begin to add strength. And then we can, once we have a base level of strength, then we can work on even more specific things like acceleration and speed, and endurance, which are all specific types of strength that we really need as runners. But we do need a basic level of strength in order to actually tolerate those internal forces that are generated when we're doing things like acceleration training and speed training and endurance training. So yeah, even distance runners need to be incorporating some of that plyometric type work, which is where we get a lot of this type of very specific strength. By doing things like skipping and box jumps and all the running drills that you guys do, that is all plyometric training. Yeah. Cool. So these posters are on the wall in my clinic, and I go through them with so many of my clients because very much of rehab is putting adults back into baby positions, because nobody necessarily teaches the baby how to move. They just go through these developmental stages. And it takes 8 to 12 years to learn to run. And so, yeah, don't worry if you haven't mastered the skill. For many of us, it takes 65, 70 years to learn how to run, and it's always a lifelong journey. But the baby doesn't just get up and run, right? And that's actually quite unique. A lot of other mammals do just get up and run, but we actually have to go through these developmental stages. And the first 12 months in particular are really, really important, from going from lying on your back and lying on your tummy to actually loading up into a crawling position, and then loading up into a lunge position at 11 months, loading into a squat position, and then learning to walk and run from there. So Uh, this is actually a lot of how the rehab looks for a lot of my runners. Like sometimes we'll put them back into crawling positions if I want to work on certain phases of how they're loading their hip joints, or the 3-month position, lying on your back with your legs at 90 degrees. That is actually really hard to do well without going into this rib flare and letting that pelvis go and loading through the low back and losing core stability. And a lot of people get really clunky through the hips because they're using the hip flexors too much. So
I was going to say, as much as this poster sort of looks a little ridiculous, if you almost ignore the baby and just look at what the adult woman is doing, you've probably seen a bunch of those exercises in just various programs you've seen over the years. And it does come up. So they are actually much harder movements than you'd think. And just give them a go. Like, just see how it feels. See if you feel tight doing some of those, maybe on some which are more one-sided. So in the lunge position, for example, is one side tighter than the other? Does one side feel better, feel worse? And just actually notice how your body feels in these positions.
And as an aside, it's also one of the reasons we don't have a lot of sit-up type exercises in the strength programs, but we have a lot of these more functional type core exercises in the program. So things like the dead bug and lots of planks and all of that, because what we want as runners is a stable lumbar spine, stable low back, so then we can then create power through our hip joints, which we don't get from doing sit-ups. And the baby never sits up. The baby rolls over. The sit-up was actually developed by the army to generate these washboard abs. But when we're talking about core, we're talking about, well, what is your stability through your lumbar spine, which isn't just the abs at the front, but it's also at the sides and it's also at the low back. Yeah.
And I think in a lot of exercises, you should be using your core for them anyway. So a lot of, I don't know if many of you do kettlebell type workouts or one-sided kettlebell. That is awesome core training anyway, without needing to really isolate it.
And it's interesting, I was listening to some interviews with some ultra marathon guys, and they were asked, what from the Sydney Trail Sisters, and they were asking all these athletes, what's the one most important part of your training that you really think is crucial? And they all said core work, which is really interesting.
Yeah. It is, even for guys doing, 100K days.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. I think that was, and how to put it together. That's right. How to actually put all this theory into practice, which is probably the most important part, because some of you are probably going, oh my God, this is so much. Well, how far do I have to go back? How does this make sense? So we thought we'd put it together in the sense of, this is sort of a typical structure of maybe one of your strength training days, and how these elements fit in and make sense. So in terms of the warm-up, as we said before, this is when you'd include things like your mobility, your stability, keep it dynamic rather than your static stretching. Don't include that in the warm-up phase. And then start by just practicing the movements. So some movements might be quite foreign to you in terms of if they're running related, maybe they're strength patterns you haven't done since you were a child. Just be patient with yourself and learn the skill of each movement. Start with either no weight or very lightweight, depending on what you can handle. Think about potentially getting someone to film you or film yourself so that you have some sort of visual feedback and can compare, okay, this is what it should be looking like, this is what I am looking like, and try to get someone else to help critique you if you're really unsure. But that visual feedback can be super important while you're learning a movement pattern.
Generally, we like people to start with the heaviest movement first, so the biggest compound movement, which uses the most muscle groups, and then work your way down to the smaller muscle groups. So you'll very rarely see me program calf raises in at the beginning. And sometimes we might, though, just to throw a spanner in the works, and variability is important, but generally we start with the heaviest lift and then we work down to the smaller muscle groups. And then generally, we sometimes, not always, but if we're going to include some speed and acceleration work, some plyometric work, we generally include them at the end of the sessions. So that's what we finish on, so that we've really sort of built up through the pyramid, essentially. I suppose you could look at it at. But yeah, they can also be done on separate days.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your schedule too. If you have more time on another day that you can fit it in, that makes sense. Fine, but I mean, a lot of you, I know we work full time and we live busy lives, so it also depends when you can fit it into your week, really.
And also what your goals are, because some people,
definitely.
you know, that's specifically what they want is to train acceleration. So the training would look a bit different as well. There would obviously be more of a focus on that sort of stuff. But to build robust runners, we like our runners looking like this. Pyramid.
And then obviously the cool down. So the cool down's always scheduled in as well. And if you can, spend a little bit of time working on breathing here as well. Breathing's so important and not done enough by all of us. But makes such a big difference to performance, recovery, sleep, stress, literally everything. Even it'll improve your work life, your relationships. Cannot stress that one enough. So if you can, spend a couple of minutes working into the cool down. And yeah, next time you work through a strength session, just think about all these different components and sort of go, oh yeah, that's where mobility fits in. That's where the heavy lift fits in, sort of the plyo side of things. It'll all start to make a lot of sense, hopefully.
One more thing about breathing. So your core muscles are breathing muscles. That's fundamentally what they are. And so the baby spends the first 6 weeks of its life lying on its back, just working on breathing and developing the stability there to gain about 10 degrees of hip range of motion. That's a lot of reps. It's like 25,000 reps every single day for 6 weeks. When was the last time we did that many reps or something? Probably when we were 6 weeks old. So really, really, really important, not just as its own thing, but actually as part of that whole stabilizing system for activating your core. And particularly as you go heavy, you definitely want to be making sure you're focusing on the breathing with the lifting as well, and even your running.
Yeah, I feel like we should do an entire new topic on breathing for strength training.
I think we need
because it's so important, and it does. But not today, because we have given you plenty to think about, I think.
Yes. There's a lot already, so that's like
If you guys have any questions, if some of that didn't make sense, or you want some more examples, or whatever it is, let us know. Happy to answer. Otherwise, we'll talk to you all soon.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.